A radio operator in the 173rd Airborne Division keys his microphone. "Eagle 6, this is Bravo 2. We're taking fire from the tree line, approximately 200 meters north of LZ Papa, requesting immediate." The transmission ends, not because the operator stopped talking, because a North Vietnamese Army sniper, listening to American frequencies from 300 meters away, had already calculated the exact position of that 10-foot antenna and put a round through the radio man's chest. 5 seconds, that's what they said in training. 5 seconds of life expectancy in a firefight, if you're carrying the PRC-77. Some optimists claimed 30 seconds. Either way, you were a priority target, and everyone knew it. But here's what nobody told those young radio operators humping 54 pounds of equipment through the jungle. The real problem wasn't the antenna, it was what they were saying into the microphone. And 7,500 miles away, in a triple canopy hell called Phuoc Tuy Province, a handful of Australian soldiers were proving that you could operate for weeks in enemy territory without saying a single word over the radio. Not because they had better equipment, not because they had different frequencies, but because they understood something American commanders refused to believe. The enemy was listening. The enemy understood English, and the enemy was using every word transmitted over American radios to kill American soldiers. This is the story of how radio discipline, or the catastrophic lack of it, became one of the most deadly differences between Australian and American operations in Vietnam, a difference so profound that Navy SEAL Roger Hayden would later say he learned more about reconnaissance in 10 days with the Australian SAS than in all his previous training combined. And what he learned started with 2 words the Australians never violated: complete silence. "Stay with me." The helicopter carrying Captain James Morrison, U.S. Army liaison officer, descended through morning haze toward Nui Dat Base in August of 1968. Morrison had seen 3 tours already, 2 with conventional infantry, 1 with Military Assistance Command Vietnam Studies and Observations Group. He'd worked with South Vietnamese Rangers, Korean Marines, and every flavor of American special operations the Pentagon could field. He thought he'd seen it all. Then he met the Australians. The briefing room at Task Force headquarters was smaller than Morrison expected. Sparse. A map of Phuoc Tuy Province covered one wall, marked with colored pins that meant nothing to him yet. 5 men sat around a table built from ammunition crates. None of them stood when Morrison entered. Australian informality, he'd been warned about that. What caught his attention was the silence, not the absence of conversation. Soldiers always went quiet when strangers entered their space, but something deeper. These men moved differently. One was cleaning a weapon, the soft cloth making no sound against metal. Another was reviewing patrol reports, turning pages with deliberate care that prevented even paper from rustling. A third sat perfectly still, not fidgeting, not shifting, just existing in absolute quietness. The patrol leader, a sergeant named Collins, finally acknowledged Morrison with a nod. "You'll be coming with us tomorrow, Captain. 5-man patrol, 3 days in the Hat Ditch." Morrison knew the Hat Ditch. The Americans called it the Iron Triangle of the South. 15 square kilometers of Viet Cong-controlled jungle where 3 American battalions had tried to operate and been systematically destroyed. The area had been declared off-limits to U.S. ground forces since January. "What's the objective?" Morrison asked. "Reconnaissance. We go in, we watch, we report what we see. Standard procedure. Radio checks every 12 hours. The Australians exchanged glances, not quite smiles, but something close. Collins leaned back in his chair. "Captain, we'll have 2 scheduled communications windows over the 72 hours, both using Morse code and one-time pads. Takes about 90 seconds to transmit, that's it." Morrison blinked. 90 seconds of radio transmission in 3 days. "If something happens, if we make contact or find something critical, we'll break silence. Otherwise, the radio stays off." This contradicted everything Morrison had been taught about modern military communications. American doctrine demanded constant contact. Platoon leaders checked in with company commanders every 30 minutes. Company commanders reported to battalion every hour. The radio was the umbilical cord that connected every level of command, and cutting it was unthinkable. "What if you need support?" Morrison asked. "Artillery? Airstrikes? Medevac? Then we call for it, but we don't make noise until we need to." That night, Morrison lay in his bunk, reviewing what he knew about radio operations in Vietnam. The numbers told a grim story. The 1st Cavalry Division had recorded 11,000 communication security violations during pre-deployment training. 11,000 instances of soldiers saying things over the radio they shouldn't have said. And that was before they ever reached Vietnam, when stress and fear made discipline even harder to maintain. The violations ranged from trivial to catastrophic. Soldiers used real names instead of call signs. They discussed specific locations in plain language. They chatted about everything from the weather to their girlfriend's last letter, never considering that someone might be listening. Forward air controllers gave detailed descriptions of target areas. Artillery forward observers called out coordinates without encryption, and commanders routinely transmitted operational plans hours before execution. The Army Security Agency had been screaming about it since 1961. Special detachments attached to every division monitored friendly communications and filed violation reports that commanders promptly ignored. The attitude, expressed most clearly by Colonel Sidney Berry of the 1st Infantry Division, was simple. It simplifies communications for units and individuals to keep the same radio frequency and particularly call signs. Frequent changes of call signs confuse friendly forces more effectively than enemy actions. Except Colonel Berry was catastrophically wrong. Morrison had seen the classified intelligence reports. He knew what most line officers didn't know, didn't want to know. The North Vietnamese Army and Viet Cong had sophisticated radio intercept capabilities. They had operators who spoke fluent English and understood American military jargon. They had direction-finding equipment that could locate transmitters within minutes. They had entire battalions dedicated to signals intelligence, monitoring American frequencies 24 hours a day, analyzing every transmission, building pattern-of-life profiles on American units that were more detailed than the Americans kept on themselves. And they were using that information to kill Americans. The battle at Landing Zone X-Ray in the Ia Drang Valley, November 1965. Lieutenant Colonel Hal Moore's 1st Battalion, 7th Cavalry, inserted into a hot landing zone, not knowing they were landing directly on top of a multi-battalion NVA force. What Moore didn't know, what he couldn't have known at the time, was that the NVA had a radio intercept reconnaissance organization on site. They were listening to every American transmission. They knew exactly when helicopters were coming. They knew the helicopters could only lift one company at a time. They knew the insertion schedule, and they used that knowledge to mass forces and attack each lift as it landed, isolating platoon-sized units before reinforcements could arrive. 234 Americans died in 3 days at LZ X-ray and the surrounding area. How many of those deaths were directly attributable to radio intercept? The classified after-action reports suggested the number was significant. Significant enough that when General Creighton Abrams, commander of Military Assistance Command Vietnam, was finally briefed on the full extent of enemy signals, intelligence capabilities, in 1970, his response entered the historical record. "This is terrible. They are reading our mail, and it has to stop." But it didn't stop, because stopping required a level of discipline that American units, for all their training and professionalism, could not consistently maintain. The patrol departed Nui Dat at 0300 hours. Morrison had been issued Australian equipment, an L-1A1 rifle, basic load of ammunition, water, minimal rations. He carried his own radio, the standard American PRC-25, but Collins had been clear. "Your radio doesn't transmit unless I tell you to, and I won't tell you to." They moved in single file through darkness. Morrison was third in the patrol order, behind Collins and the lead scout. The rear security followed 20 meters back. The spacing felt wrong to Morrison. American patrols maintained visual contact at all times, men close enough to see hand signals in jungle darkness. These Australians moved with gaps large enough that Morrison frequently lost sight of the man ahead. But he could hear them, or rather, he couldn't hear them. Morrison had spent years in the jungle. He knew the sounds of movement, boots crushing vegetation, equipment rattling, breath coming hard under exertion. He heard none of it from the Australians. They moved like smoke, finding paths through the undergrowth that required no force, no sound. When they had to move through dense vegetation, they did it with glacial slowness, parting branches with care, replacing them without noise. They had been moving for 2 hours when Collins raised his fist. The patrol froze. Morrison froze with them, one foot still in the air, feeling the burn in his thigh as he held position. 30 seconds passed, a minute. Collins's hand moved. Subtle gestures Morrison couldn't interpret in the darkness. The lead scout moved forward, disappearing into black jungle. 2 minutes later, he reappeared, touched Collins's shoulder 3 times, and the patrol moved again. Morrison wanted to ask what they'd stopped for. He wanted to know what the hand signals meant, but asking required talking, and talking was apparently forbidden. So he filed the questions away and kept moving. Dawn found them 6 kilometers from Nui Dat, deep in the Hat Ditch. Collins selected a position in dense undergrowth, and the patrol established what American doctrine called a patrol base. Except American patrol bases involved clearing fields of fire, setting up defensive positions, posting guards in rotation. The Australians did none of this. They simply melted into the jungle, each man finding a position that offered concealment and a view of the surrounding terrain. Then they waited. Morrison checked his watch. 0530. Back at American bases, radios would be crackling with morning reports, companies checking in with battalions, battalion operations centers updating division headquarters. Radio operators across Vietnam would be keying microphones, transmitting call signs and status reports and weather observations and 1,000 other details that seemed essential to modern military operations. The Australians sat in silence. By 0800, Morrison was certain something was wrong. 3 hours without radio contact violated every protocol he knew. He pulled out his notebook, wrote a question. "Shouldn't we check in?" and showed it to Collins. Collins shook his head. He pointed at his watch, held up 5 fingers. 5 hours until the scheduled transmission window. Until then, nothing. Morrison settled in to wait, and that's when he started to understand. American patrols, even the best-trained special operations units, carried with them an envelope of noise, radio static even when squelched, the hiss of an open frequency, the occasional click of a handset being keyed, the whispered radio checks, all of it created an acoustic signature, faint but detectable to anyone listening carefully. The Australians had eliminated that signature entirely. Their radios were switched off, not on standby, not with volume turned low, completely off. The elimination of radio noise meant they could hear the jungle with perfect clarity. And what Morrison heard, as he sat in that patrol base listening, was everything. A bird call repeated 3 times from the east. Collins's hand moved, pointing. The lead scout nodded. They'd identified the bird species, determined the call was genuine, filed the information away as part of the jungle's baseline. 20 minutes later, a different bird call, this one artificial. Morrison couldn't tell the difference, but Collins could. His hand moved again, different gestures. The patrol shifted, weapons oriented toward the sound. They waited. Nothing happened. After 10 minutes, Collins relaxed, and the patrol stood down. "You heard it," Collins whispered, the first words spoken in 8 hours. "NVA patrol. 4, maybe 5 men." They were signaling to each other. Morrison had heard nothing but a bird call. "How do you know it was enemy?" "Wrong bird for this time of day." And the intervals were too regular. Human pattern, not animal. American doctrine would have called that contact, would have demanded an immediate radio report to higher headquarters, would have generated requests for supporting fires, air reconnaissance, possibly a quick reaction force, all of which would have required multiple radio transmissions, potentially exposing the patrol's position to the very enemy they were trying to avoid. The Australians simply noted the enemy presence and adjusted their patrol route to avoid contact. The first scheduled transmission window came at 1300 hours. Collins assembled the radio, a different model than American sets, more compact and with encryption capability built in. He prepared a message, writing it out in abbreviated code on a one-time pad. The message, when Morrison saw it, was cryptic even to him. Grid coordinates, numerical indicators, letter codes that meant nothing without the corresponding cipher key. At exactly 1300 hours, Collins switched on the radio, sent the message in Morse code, received a brief acknowledgement, and switched the radio back off. Total transmission time, 47 seconds. "That's it?" Morrison asked. "That's it. Base knows where we are. They know we're operational. They know what we've observed. If they need us to do something different, they'll tell us in the next transmission window." "What if something changes? What if we run into trouble before then?" Collins looked at Morrison with something that might have been pity. "Captain, if we run into trouble, the whole of Phuoc Tuy Province will know about it. We won't need a radio to call for help. They'll hear the gunfire." That night, Morrison learned why radio silence mattered, in ways that went beyond avoiding enemy detection. The patrol was observing a trail junction, a location intelligence suspected was being used as a staging point for VC movements. They'd been in position for 3 hours, absolutely still, when an enemy patrol approached. 7 men, heavily armed, moving with the casual confidence of soldiers in their own territory. The enemy passed within 15 meters of the Australian position. So close Morrison could see the details of their uniforms, count the magazine pouches on their chest rigs, read the expressions on their faces. They were talking. Not quietly, not with the caution of soldiers in a combat zone, but with normal conversational volume. Joking, from what Morrison could tell by their tone. They had no idea the Australians were there. If this had been an American patrol, the protocol would have been clear. Observe the enemy, count them, note their equipment and direction of travel, then call it in. A radio transmission requesting permission to engage or instructions to continue surveillance. The enemy would hear that transmission, might not understand the words, might not be able to locate the source immediately, but they'd know someone was watching. Their behavior would change. They'd become cautious, alert, dangerous. The Australians did nothing. They watched the enemy patrol pass. They counted weapons and equipment. They noted everything, stored it in memory, and remained absolutely silent. The enemy continued on their way, never knowing they'd been observed. After the NVA patrol disappeared, Collins allowed himself a slight smile. That's the third patrol we've seen use this trail today. They're getting comfortable, sloppy. That's good for us. Morrison understood then what the Australians had created. Not just a patrol, but an intelligence-gathering apparatus that could operate indefinitely in enemy territory, because the enemy never knew it was there. And the key to that invisibility was radio silence. American soldiers talked too much, not because they were unprofessional or poorly trained, but because the entire American military system was built on constant communication. Commanders expected updates. Operations centers demanded status reports. Supporting units needed coordination. The whole vast machinery of American military power required constant streams of information flowing through radio networks, and every transmission was a betrayal of position. The second day brought another revelation. An American helicopter, a Huey gunship, flew over their position at low altitude. Morrison instinctively reached for his radio, preparing to identify himself as friendly forces to avoid being engaged. Collins stopped him with a hand on his wrist. "They're not looking for us," Collins said. "They're on their own mission. But if they see movement, they might engage. They won't see us, and if they do, they'll identify us by our equipment before they shoot. Besides, turning on the radio would do more harm than good." Morrison wanted to argue. American doctrine was clear. Always maintain positive identification with friendly aircraft to prevent fratricide. But he was learning that Australian doctrine operated on different principles. The risk of a friendly fire incident from a helicopter that probably wouldn't see them anyway was less than the risk of compromising the patrol's position by transmitting. It was a calculated gamble that Americans, with their overwhelming firepower and constant air support, never had to make. The Australians, operating in small numbers with minimal support, had learned to accept risks that American commanders would find unacceptable. That evening, Morrison witnessed something that crystallized the fundamental difference in approach. An American convoy was moving along Route 2, about 4 kilometers from their position. Morrison could hear the vehicles, the diesel engines laboring under load. Then he heard the radios. Even at 4 kilometers, in jungle that should have dampened sound, he could hear the squelch brakes, the burst of static, the faint voices of American radio operators maintaining their constant chatter. "Convoy headed to Vung Tau," Collins observed. "Supply run." "They're talking about it on open channels. Grid coordinates, departure times, route information. Might as well send the VC an engraved invitation to set up an ambush." Morrison had heard similar convoys 100 times, never considered how much information was leaking over the radio. Don't they encrypt? Sometimes, when they remember. When the encryption gear is working, which it usually isn't. And even when they do encrypt, they talk around the encryption. We're 30 minutes out from the location we discussed. Everyone listening knows what location, knows what time, knows where to be waiting. It was, Morrison realized, a fundamental incompatibility of operational philosophy. Americans relied on technology and firepower to overcome tactical disadvantages. If the enemy knew where you were, you simply brought enough firepower to make it not matter. You called in artillery. You called in airstrikes. You fought through the ambush with superior weapons and training. The Australians preferred to never be ambushed in the first place. The final scheduled transmission window came on the third day. Collins prepared his message, encrypted it with the one-time pad, and sent it in the same 47 seconds of Morse code. Then he packed up the radio and prepared the patrol to move to the extraction point. "That's it?" Morrison asked. 3 days of observations, and we send maybe 5 minutes of total radio traffic? Everything we saw, everyone we counted, it's all in the message. Operations will compile it with other patrol reports, build a picture of enemy activity. That's how it works. They moved to the extraction point, a small clearing where a helicopter would pick them up. Standard procedure, Morrison knew. What wasn't standard was the silence maintained until the very moment the helicopter appeared. Only then did Collins switch on his radio and transmit a brief signal to guide the aircraft in. The flight back to Nui Dat took 20 minutes. Morrison spent it reviewing everything he'd witnessed. 3 days in the jungle. 3 days of constant observation, movement through enemy territory, intelligence gathering, and less than 6 minutes of radio transmission total. Compare that to an equivalent American patrol. Radio checks every 30 minutes, minimum. That's 144 transmissions over 3 days, each one potentially giving away position, each one providing information to enemy signals intelligence. Even if each transmission was brief, properly encrypted, following perfect procedure, it created an acoustic signature, a pattern that could be analyzed and exploited. The Australians had created no pattern because there was no pattern to create. Back at Nui Dat, Morrison debriefed with the Australian intelligence officer, a major who'd been running patrols like this for 2 years. Morrison asked the question that had been building for 3 days. "Do American units know about your radio procedures?" The major shrugged. "We've tried to share. Had joint operations with SEALs, with Special Forces, with MAC VSOG. Some of them get it. Most don't. Their command structure won't allow it." "What do you mean?" "American commanders need constant updates. They can't function without knowing where every unit is, what every unit is doing, every minute of every day. If a patrol goes silent for 12 hours, commanders panic. They assume something's gone wrong. They send in quick reaction forces, air reconnaissance, create a whole situation that's worse than just maintaining radio silence in the first place." Morrison understood. The problem wasn't training or equipment or individual discipline. The problem was systematic, institutional. The entire American military machine was built on a foundation of constant communication, and changing that would require rebuilding the machine from the ground up. The report Morrison filed after his rotation with the Australians was classified at the highest levels. In it, he documented everything he'd observed, compared Australian and American radio procedures, and reached conclusions that contradicted decades of American military doctrine. The key finding? Radio discipline, more than any other single factor, determined patrol survival in denied territory. Patrols that maintained radio silence could operate for weeks in areas where American units couldn't survive for days. The enemy could not ambush what they could not locate, and radio transmissions were the primary method of location. Morrison's recommendations were radical. Reduce scheduled radio checks from every 30 minutes to every 12 hours. Train all radio operators in Morse code and encryption. Institute mandatory radio silence except during actual emergencies. Punish violations of radio discipline as severely as violations of weapons safety. The recommendations were noted, filed, and ignored, because implementing them would have required acknowledging an uncomfortable truth. American doctrine, built on overwhelming firepower and constant communication, had a fatal flaw when facing an enemy who could hear every word transmitted. Navy SEAL Roger Hayden learned this lesson in 1968 during a 10-day joint operation with Australian SAS in the Rung Sat Special Zone. Hayden, a veteran of multiple combat tours, considered himself an expert in reconnaissance operations. Then he spent 10 days with the Australians, and everything he thought he knew about operating in hostile territory changed. For the entire 10 days, Hayden would later recount, the Aussies didn't say a word. Not on the radio, not to each other unless absolutely necessary. They communicated entirely through hand and arm signals, and at first I thought it was excessive. I thought they were being too cautious. Then I realized something. In 10 days operating in territory where American units were getting hit every time they went out, we never got ambushed, never even took fire, because nobody knew we were there. The Australians had developed a comprehensive system of silent communication, over 100 different hand signals, each with specific meaning. Signals for enemy contact, for change of direction, for halting, for danger, for all clear. Signals for counting enemy personnel, for identifying weapons, for designating targets. An entire language that could be used without making a sound. American units used hand signals too, but in a limited way. Basic signals for immediate tactical situations, enemy sighted, take cover, move forward. But for complex communication, for coordination of movement, for detailed intelligence reporting, Americans relied on radio. The Australians had eliminated that reliance entirely, and in doing so, they'd eliminated the single greatest vulnerability in small unit operations. The difference showed in the statistics. Australian SAS conducted nearly 1,200 patrols in Vietnam over 6 years. Their casualties: 1 killed in action, 1 died of wounds, 3 killed accidentally, 1 missing, 1 death from illness. 7 total deaths in 6 years of combat operations. Compare that to American radio operators, whose life expectancy in combat was famously measured in seconds. The exact number varied depending on who was telling the story: 5 seconds, 6 seconds, 30 seconds. But everyone agreed that carrying a radio in combat was a death sentence. The 10-foot antenna marked you as a priority target. The radio's weight slowed you down, and the constant need to transmit gave away your position to every enemy within listening range. The irony was that the Australians carried radios too. The same basic equipment, sometimes better, sometimes worse than American sets, but they carried them turned off, wrapped in waterproof material, packed away until absolutely needed. The radio was a tool of last resort, not the primary means of communication. American commanders couldn't comprehend this approach. When Australian officers tried to explain their radio procedures during joint planning sessions, American operations officers would interrupt with concern. What if you need fire support? What if you run into trouble? What if we need to update your mission? The Australian answer was always the same. If we need support, we'll call for it. If we run into trouble, you'll hear about it. And if the mission changes, tell us during the next scheduled transmission window. This violated American military culture at its deepest level. American commanders, trained to believe that control required constant communication, could not imagine operating without their umbilical cord of radio traffic. The idea of sending a patrol into hostile territory and not hearing from them for 12, 24, or 72 hours was unconscionable. But the Australians proved it worked. Not just worked, but worked better than the American alternative. The North Vietnamese Army understood this better than the Americans did. Captured documents from NVA signals intelligence units revealed the extent to which they relied on American radio traffic. They had operators who could identify individual American radio operators by their voice and transmission style. They had linguists who understood not just English, but American military jargon. They had analysts who could take fragmentary radio intercepts and construct complete pictures of American operations. One captured training manual from the 47th Reconnaissance Battalion included this instruction: pay special attention to American forward air controllers and artillery observers. They will transmit target coordinates, strike times, and observation positions in clear language. This information can be used to avoid bombardment and eliminate observation posts. Another document from a Vitai political officer in Phuoc Tuy Province contained a direct order that perfectly captured how the enemy viewed different Allied forces. Americans can be defeated. They depend on air support and artillery. Australians avoid. They are worse than us. They live in the jungle. The Viet Cong had learned that Americans announced themselves with radio traffic. You could hear them coming, avoid them, ambush them, or simply wait for them to leave. The Australians were different. They appeared without warning, observed without being seen, and disappeared without trace. The VC called them Ma Rung, phantoms of the jungle. And a large part of what made them phantoms was their refusal to transmit. The National Security Agency tried to address American radio security problems through Operation Purple Dragon, initiated in 1966. The program analyzed enemy intercept capabilities, identified vulnerabilities in American communications, and recommended procedural changes. The findings were damning. B-52 strikes against North Vietnam were being compromised by radio traffic. An altitude reservation message sent from Manila to air traffic control centers throughout the Far East to warn civilian aircraft away from strike zones was being monitored by the North Vietnamese. They could predict where B-52s would strike, when they would strike, and evacuate the areas before the bombs fell. Fighter-bomber strikes from Thailand were being compromised by KC-135 tanker aircraft, whose radio call signs identified their refueling tracks. Since each track corresponded to specific target areas, NVA analysts could predict where strikes would occur simply by monitoring which tankers were airborne. Even marine amphibious operations were being compromised by radio leaks. Communications about landing sites, insertion times, and force composition were being transmitted in ways the enemy could intercept and analyze. Purple Dragon recommended immediate changes, better encryption, stricter radio discipline, frequent changes of call signs and frequencies, limiting radio traffic to essential communications only. The recommendations were technically sound, tactically necessary, and largely ignored, because implementing them was hard. Harder than it sounds to tell soldiers under stress in combat to shut up and maintain discipline. Harder than it sounds to convince commanders that less communication might mean better security. Harder than it sounds to change an institutional culture that had been built over decades of conventional warfare where radio was king. The Australians had built their culture differently from the start. British special operations traditions, honed in Malaya and Borneo, emphasized stealth and independence over constant communication. When Australian SAS deployed to Vietnam, they brought that culture with them and refined it through hard experience. They learned which radios could be heard at what distances. They learned that even encrypted transmissions could be direction found and used to locate patrol positions. They learned that scheduled transmission windows, using Morse code and one-time pad encryption, provided adequate command and control while minimizing exposure. Most importantly, they learned that the jungle itself could be their communication network. The natural sounds of birds and animals, when properly understood, provided better intelligence than any radio network. The ability to hear the enemy coming, because your own patrol made no noise and transmitted no radio signals, was more valuable than any amount of air support. American soldiers who operated with the Australians came away changed. Roger Hayden described his 10 days as a revelation in fieldcraft. Other Americans echoed similar sentiments, but when they returned to American units and tried to implement Australian techniques, they encountered resistance from command structures that couldn't adapt. I tried to get my platoon to maintain radio silence during patrols, one Special Forces sergeant reported in a 1969 interview. Lasted exactly one patrol. Battalion called for a radio check 30 minutes in. I didn't respond, maintaining silence like the Australians taught me. Battalion assumed we were in trouble and sent a quick reaction force. Created a whole clusterfuck that compromised our position and endangered everyone involved. After that, I went back to standard radio procedures, even though I knew it was getting guys killed. This was the tragedy of American radio operations in Vietnam. Individual soldiers understood the problem. Small unit leaders understood the problem. Even some senior officers understood the problem. But the system couldn't change, because changing would require admitting that American doctrine, American training, American technology, and American command and control procedures had fundamental flaws. Easier to blame the individual soldiers. Easier to issue more radio security guidelines that nobody followed. Easier to develop better encryption equipment that was too cumbersome to use in combat. Easier to continue doing what had always been done, even as the casualties mounted. Lieutenant General Charles Meyer, commander of the 1st Signal Brigade in Vietnam, summed up the situation in his post-war assessment. All users were more or less aware of their vulnerabilities to enemy intercept, analysis, and decoding, and the need for authentication and encoding. The gap between this knowledge and actual practice in combat units was immense, and in Vietnam it was an insurmountable problem. Insurmountable. That word appeared in official assessments, in classified reports, in congressional testimony. The problem was known, understood, documented in excruciating detail. But it was insurmountable because solving it would require changes the institution would not accept. The Australians proved it wasn't insurmountable. They proved that small units could operate effectively, even in the most hostile environments with minimal radio communication. They proved that radio silence enhanced survival rather than compromising it. They proved that well-trained soldiers, operating with clear procedures and mutual trust, could function for extended periods without constant command oversight. But American military culture in the 1960s could not absorb these lessons. The institutional commitment to technology, firepower, and centralized control was too strong. The belief that more communication meant better command and control was too deeply embedded. So American radio operators continued to key their microphones every 30 minutes, transmitting call signs and grid coordinates and status reports, and enemy signals intelligence operators continued to listen, plot, and direct forces to ambush positions. And the life expectancy of American radio men remained measured in seconds. The final assessment of Australian radio procedures didn't come until years after the war. In classified studies conducted by the U.S. Army Command and General Staff College, analysts compared Australian and American patrol effectiveness in similar operational environments. The conclusions were unambiguous. Australian patrols, operating with minimal radio traffic, had significantly longer operational endurance in denied territory. They gathered better intelligence because they could observe without being detected. They had fewer casualties because the enemy couldn't locate them through radio direction finding. And they achieved better tactical results because they maintained the element of surprise. The studies recommended adopting Australian-style radio procedures for American Special Operations units. Some recommendations were implemented decades later in the post-Vietnam era. Modern Special Operations forces use many of the techniques the Australians pioneered: scheduled transmission windows, burst communications, heavy reliance on alternative signaling methods. But during the war itself, when it mattered most, the lessons went unlearned. Roger Hayden's testimony about his 10 days with the Australians includes one particularly striking observation. Their fieldcraft was so good, he said, not because they had better training or better soldiers, though they were damn good, but because they understood something we didn't. In the jungle, noise is death, and radio transmissions are the loudest noise you can make. That understanding, that fundamental insight into the nature of small unit combat in denied territory, separated those who became phantoms of the jungle from those who became targets. The Australians mastered it through culture, training, and institutional commitment to radio discipline. They paid for that mastery with years of hard experience in Borneo and Malaya before Vietnam. The Americans never quite got there. They had the equipment. They had brave soldiers. They had tactical innovations and technological advantages. But they couldn't overcome the institutional inertia that demanded constant communication, that measured command effectiveness by the volume of radio traffic, that treated silence as a problem rather than an asset. And so, the war continued with American radio men carrying their 54 pounds of equipment, extending their 10-foot antennas, keying their microphones every 30 minutes, and dying at rates that made radio operator one of the most dangerous jobs in Vietnam. While 7,500 miles away, Australian patrols moved through the same jungles in complete silence, unseen and unheard, proving that there was another way. The lesson was there for anyone willing to learn it. Some did. Navy SEALs, Army Special Forces, Marine Reconnaissance, all incorporated elements of Australian radio discipline into their procedures. But the broader American military, with its divisions and brigades and massive logistical tail, never quite absorbed the fundamental insight. In war, silence can be louder than speech. Invisibility can be more powerful than firepower. And sometimes the best communication is no communication at all. The Australians understood this, and in understanding it, they survived when others did not.